So from Nazareth, isn't Nazareth from that? Where is it from? In Jerusalem. Does it? But he hasn't stored. Doesn't he store in Nazareth? Oh, on this day. This is his last day. Oh, it's his last day. Oh, I'm sure. They're making it very. No, I know. Just typical. No, of course. What? I agree. So anybody says anything, you just stand up. Well, I said
and we don't have to come back tomorrow. And we don't have to come back tomorrow.
Yes, that's all over. Did you have any results on there?
In the beginning,
Because they were showing
you're going to stand right behind the microphone. Not now, but unless you want to come up. Okay. No, you'll come up with me.
Yep.
Oh, this is good. It's more, I'm surprised.
But anyways.
No. You bad time. Well, Helen Gross helped me the first year. We'd never done anything. And I just kind of, and I had 3 speakers. I said, what do I do? Everything was first. But then we kind of got
It's just he's an amazing storyteller. He's amazing. Well, we're gonna go sit down. Yes, you don't need me right away.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Yom Hashoah. We begin in prayer. So let's place ourselves in the presence of the God who is always with us. God of our fathers, you chose Abraham and his descendants to bring your name to the nations. We are deeply saddened by the behavior of those who in the course of history have caused these children of yours to suffer, and asking your forgiveness, we wish to commit ourselves to genuine brotherhood with the people of the covenant. Tonight we light 7 candles in memory of those who have died during the Holocaust. And we invite Sophia and Ashley to come up and to help us. For those who have died, our response will be, we shall never forget them. For those who have died in the cities, in the towns and in the shtetls, which no longer shielded them as homes should, for them we light the first candle. We shall never forget them.
Betrayed by former friends, by neighbors, by those for whom a human life was worth less than a loaf of bread, we light the second candle.
We shall not forget them.
Young and old have hunted and killed as they hid in the fields and forests. Young and old were hunted and killed as they hid in the fields and forests. For them we light the third candle.
We shall not forget them.
For the multitude who died in the ghettos, hungry, brutalized, in a world they can no longer recognize, for them we light the fourth candle. We shall not
forget them.
Murdered but not forgotten were all who perished in the concentration camps, alone, afraid, in a world gone mad. For them, we light the fifth candle. We shall not forget them.
For the 1.5 million children who were brutally cut down in their youth, each a life so very precious, for them we light the sixth candle.
We shall not forget them.
For victims of genocides that are occurring today, for them who've lost their lives, we light the seventh candle. We shall not forget them.
Good evening. My name is Jeanette Parmigiani, and as a member of the Church of the Resurrection, I would like to welcome you here this evening to our 30th Yom Hashoah commemoration. Our long-running program is unique in the Archdiocese. Mazel Tov Resurrection, which is a strange. This evening we are here to remember the Holocaust and learn the lessons of the Holocaust. To remember the final solution, the code name for the cruel and inhumane torture and murder of victims, 6 million Jews, by the Nazi perpetrators, and their collaborators, enabled by bystanders. There were 5 million other victims, for example, gypsies, the mentally ill, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals. However, as a renowned Holocaust survivor, Elie Wiesel said, while not all victims were Jewish, all Jews were victims. To remember the Holocaust occurred in Christian Europe. The perpetrators, collaborators, bystanders were Christian. Many were Catholic. To remember the Holocaust is Catholic history. The Nazis' racial anti-Semitism, bigotry, and hatred of Jews was based on over 2,000 years of Christianity's religious prejudice against the Jews, anti-Judaism. Anti-Judaism provided fertile ground for racial prejudice against the Jews, anti-Semitism throughout Europe. Mindful of its own history of anti-Judaism and its quote-unquote teaching of contempt about Jews, the Second Vatican Council in 1965 issued the historic document Nostra Aetate, repudiating the deicide charge and recognizing the eternal covenant between God and the Jewish people. We must learn from the rescuers, the precious few, who risked their lives and the lives of their families to save Jews. Most were Christian, many were Catholic. Today we would call them upstanders, a person who stands up, speaks out, and refuses to let injustice go unchecked, exhibiting how one person can make a difference. The term upstander was coined in 2008, but accurately describes Oskar Schindler, who was the focus of this evening's program. The Holocaust did not begin in gas chambers. It began with words. We must use our words to speak up against racism, against hate, against anti-Semitism. Upstanding is not confined to war or other tragedies, but to everyday life, the schoolyard, an office, social gatherings. Holocaust remembrance is a history of events which occurred from 1938 to 1945. Holocaust lessons apply to the present. The Jewish community's pledge of never again is dedicated to all groups everywhere. Tonight we will learn from Mrs. Lola Hahn, the daughter and niece of 3 Jewish women, Schindler Jews, whose lives were saved by Oskar Schindler, as she relates her family's compelling story. Lola.
It's very hard for me to talk about the brutalities, violence, and the unhuman persecution against us. And I don't think words can explain it. However, we can't let this crime to be forgotten. We have to keep remembering with each generation, so we can guard the world against another Hitler. I took big chances to go to see my mom. I had to go see my mother. I didn't tell her about my condition. I didn't want her to worry, but I'm sure she knew. My sisters were in a transport to be already on their way. And I got them out in the last minute. This was almost the end of the Camp Lashof. And they were the Russians were coming closer, and they were liquidating the Camp Lashof. Accidentally, I saw it was just accident because I was on the 3rd floor of the villa, just happening to dust the window, when I saw a lot of women marching down to the entrance of the camp with white kerchief on. And I came running to the kitchen and I said to my friend Lena, I said, people are leaving the camp. My sisters might be there. I'm going. She said, don't go. I said, I'm going. And I grabbed the white kerchief, running down. I was lucky to get him out. But he found out about it. that God had permitted this crime. And I still don't have the answer.
Please allow me to introduce my Aunt Helen, my mother's younger sister. You just heard 4 segments from her first testimonial when she was 63 years old, sharing some of her most profound experiences during the Holocaust. She presented this at a program in November 1988 at her synagogue, the Suburban Temple in Wantagh, New York, marking 50 years since Kristallnacht. As you heard, my name is Lola Hahn. I am first-generation American and a child of Holocaust survivors from Poland. I am here thanks to a kind man who saved my mother and her sisters during the Holocaust. It was a Sunday morning in March of 1982. I was 31 years old and getting ready to leave for a business trip to Hong Kong. Even though I had already spoken with my parents earlier to bid my farewells, a book review I came across in the New York Times prompted me to immediately call my mother. This could not wait until I returned 2 weeks later. Although the name Oskar Schindler had no significance to me at the time, there were other names and places mentioned in the book that had some familiarity. When I called my mother and shared the title of the book, Schindler's List, I asked her, who was he, if she knew him, and if she knew him, and what connection, if any, he had to her. It was at that moment that I learned that she and her 2 sisters were placed on a list and ultimately saved. They were among 1,200 survivors chosen for Schindler's List. After my return from Hong Kong, I purchased the book immediately and read it in one night. This was the beginning of my learning the unbelievable story of how my mother and her 2 sisters were some of the fortunate ones who survived the Holocaust. Their journey wasn't an easy one. This picture was the last picture with my grandmother Lola and her 3 daughters, taken sometime in 1937 on the side of the famous Wawel Royal Castle in Krakow. Poland, their hometown. It was one picture that my aunt was able to save. My mother, Sidonia, on the right, was 17. Betty, Bronya, her middle sister on the left, was 15. And Helena, the youngest sister, standing behind their mother, was 12. The Sternlich sisters, as they were referred to by their maiden name, had loving parents and a happy and secure childhood. Their residence on the outskirts of Krakow was where their family found security and did not experience discrimination or anti-Semitic expressions. It wasn't until the children were a little older that my grandparents chose to move into the city of Krakow, where they became uneasy about letting my mother out in the evenings because of the individuals who were attacking Jews. The family was modern in their daily life and observant in following all traditions of Judaism. Polish was spoken in and out of their home. Yiddish was only spoken at their maternal grandparents who lived by maternal grandparents who lived nearby, so the girls did have an understanding of the language. After my aunt finished her public school studies, her plan was to continue on to a vocational school where both my mother and other aunt had been attending. Unfortunately, their continued education was cut short when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. My grandfather, Simon Sterling, was a man of integrity and kindness. His attention to his family was always with devotion and good humor. He served in World War I in the Polish Army and shared stories of his successes during his service, which his daughters loved hearing. He earned a comfortable living running a metal shop in ironwork and providing locksmith services, and treated his employees with fairness and generosity. In November of 1939, restrictive edicts were issued and Jewish businesses were taken away. My grandfather was still allowed to keep his shop, working for the Gestapo, which gave him a sense of security of being a needed worker. My grandmother Lola, who I was named after, was a beautiful woman who filled their home with good cheer, playfulness, and lots of songs. She was a good cook and regularly contributed meals for sick people in a sanitarium. My grandmother was a passionate person who had a strong commitment to social justice. By March 20th, 1941, their whole family was forced to relocate. By March 20th, 1941, their whole family was forced to relocate to the Krakow ghetto in Poland. They were told to pack only what they could carry and must relocate there within 2 days without knowing what they would have to face and what would be a necessity. The ghetto was not set up in the historical Jewish quarter of Kashmirs, the area they had lived in, but on Podgorj, on the right bank of the Vistula River. They had to walk across the bridge to the ghetto, searching for a place in a house already filled to capacity. The ghetto territory covered 15 streets, consisting of 320 houses with 3,167 rooms. A wall in the style of Jewish tombstones and a wooden fence surrounded the ghetto. All windows and doors overlooking or leading to the area inside were closed with bricks, and there were 4 guarded entrances. Most of the houses were dilapidated. Before the war, there were about 3,000 inhabitants, but now more than 15,000 people were crowded together. Life in the ghetto was one of hunger, disease, and overcrowding. My grandparents and their children managed to find strength in the fact that as long as they were all together, they could endure. In September 1942, my grandfather was taken from their home by the Nazis, never to be seen again. My grandmother, along with her 3 daughters, remained in the Krakow ghetto and moved to the labor camp, Camp Plaszow in Krakow, after the ghetto was liquidated in early 1943. Camp Plaszow was later constructed into a concentration camp. Unfortunately, my grandmother fell ill and passed away in late spring 1944. On the third day of their internment at Plaszow, Helen was washing windows in the barracks when Get, the camp commandant, entered the room. He commented on the exemplary job she was doing. He then ordered her to go to his villa on the grounds of the camp to work as his housemaid. As his maid, she lived in the cellar of his villa with another woman who also served as his maid. My aunt observed Commandant Get often shooting prisoners from the balcony of his villa, and she saw him murder several people and order the deaths of many more. He also beat her. My aunt received small kindnesses from a civilian, a frequent happy visitor to the villa, who she wasn't sure she could trust because he seemed very friendly with Commandant Get. She recalled him saying to her, "You're going to be all right. Remember the people in Egypt? They were freed, so you will be too." That man was war profiteer Oskar Schindler. Who was Oskar Schindler? Oskar Schindler was a man who enjoyed fast living. He liked to race motorcycles, and his wife thought he drank too much. Schindler joined the Nazi Party to make money. And after the Nazi invasion of Poland, Schindler made plans to start a business there and become rich. Instead, he saw the plight of the Polish Jews, the forced labor, the Nazi brutality, and the executions. In his mission to save Jews, Oskar Schindler lost his fortune and risked his own life. He could not let these things happen without trying to make a difference. In 1939, Schindler acquired an enamelware factory in Krakow, Poland, which employed at the factory's peak in 1944 about 1,750 workers, of which 1,000 were Jews. His Nazi connections helped him protect his Jewish workers from deportation and death in the Nazi concentration camps. As time went on, Schindler had to give Nazi officials even larger bribes and gifts of luxury items, obtainable only on the black market to keep his workers safe. He continued to bribe the officials until the end of World War II in Europe in May 1945, by which time he had spent his entire fortune on bribes and black market purchases of supplies for his workers. To quote one of his survivors, "He was life and he was our future. He was God." In my Aunt Helen's position, she had many opportunities to speak with Oskar Schindler when he made these visits to the villa. At one of his last visits, Oskar Schindler told her, "You are coming with me." He also asked if she had any family at Camp Plaszow, and ultimately, all 3 sisters were placed on Schindler's list. My mother and her sisters were among 300 women who spent 3 weeks in the Auschwitz concentration camp. And when new prisoners would arrive at a camp, one of the first things they were asked to do was get rid of all their clothing. And then women, separate from men, but these were women, these were the 300 women, were placed in a large room. And the large room would have shower heads. And this was much later on, towards the end of the war, and at that point, a lot of the prisoners in these camps knew what that could potentially mean. It was either a matter of life or death. Either there would be water coming out of the shower heads or gas. My mother and her 2 sisters were standing there huddled together, And then all of a sudden, the water started coming out of the shower heads. And although the conditions were horrible, they couldn't help but smile because they were just so elated that their lives at that point were still being saved. And my mother said to her younger sister, Helen, it's water. Why aren't you smiling? And my aunt was going like this. I mentioned when I showed you the picture of my grandmother with her 3 daughters, my aunt had a very tiny depiction of that picture hidden in her mouth, and so she couldn't open her mouth. Following their brief time in Auschwitz, they went on to Schindler's factory in Brinlitz, Czechoslovakia, where they spent 7 months before being liberated on May 6, 1945. All 3 sisters were able to move forward in life, finding meaning and purpose, showing compassion, strength, and love. In January 1949, they arrived in America and had reinvented themselves, devoting considerable energy to the present and future. They did not dwell on the past, and my sister, cousins, and I did not ask too many questions. Whatever memories they had harbored must have been very painful. My mother and her sisters didn't keep these truths from us about their lives during the Holocaust intentionally. They were simply pieces of a former life they chose to leave behind. They also felt that they were protecting the children by not telling us their harrowing tale. It was important to them that their children lead normal lives and not hate or be afraid. 30 years ago, the movie Schindler's List was released based on the book that was published in 1982. Like millions of other people, my aunt saw the movie. To quote my Aunt Helen, unlike most other people, she saw in it herself, her family and friends that she will never see again. 5.5 years of my life are portrayed in this movie. My aunt is grateful to Steven Spielberg for bringing this movie to life. Schindler's List changed the lives for many Holocaust survivors as well as for Steven Spielberg. It provided them with a platform where they finally felt they could share their stories with others. As Spielberg was finishing up the film, he began to form the idea of what later became the University of Southern California Shoah Foundation as a way to continue to record the stories of Holocaust survivors. He started it on the premises of Universal Studios prior to it moving to the university campus. It became a 20-year project where nearly 52,000 Holocaust survivors' testimonies were collected and preserved, and later survivors of other genocides were added. Today, it continues to expand its educational outreach to ensure that the survivors and their testimonies serve as teachers for future generations. Testimony from the 1937 Nanjing Massacre in China, the Cambodian genocide of 1975 through 1979, the 1994 Rwandan Tutsi genocide, and the ongoing conflicts in the Central African Republic and South Sudan have been added to its visual history archive. It also includes testimonies about contemporary acts of violence against Jews. In December 2018, at the 25th anniversary release of a special edition of Schindler's List, Spielberg shared the following. It is difficult to believe that it's been 25 years since Schindler's List first arrived in theaters. The true stories of the magnitude and tragedy of the Holocaust are ones that must never be forgotten and the film's lessons about the critical importance of countering hatred continue to reverberate today. My Aunt Helen took on a mission to share her story and the story of her people, to ensure that we remember the Holocaust and educate the citizens of every country about its timeless lessons so that no one will ever forget about the lives lost in the Holocaust. To quote my aunt's exact words, "The Holocaust is meaningful not only for survivors and their families, but for all humanity. Education is critical as a means of ensuring that genocide does not occur again, or when it does, the world will not stand silently by as innocents are slaughtered. This is not a Jewish issue, but one that has great importance for all faith communities." My aunt started sharing her story in early 1994 after the movie was released. She spoke at many schools, adult group events, churches, and synagogues, predominantly in New York, New Jersey, and Florida. She also produced several testimonials that are housed at different Holocaust institutions, including the one for the Shoah Foundation. The 4 video segments you heard at the beginning of my presentation came from a testimonial that I was unfamiliar with. A few years ago, I was doing research on the Holocaust Museum archive website concerning my aunt, and this link happened to appear. When I mentioned it to one of her children, she had no idea it had been donated by the synagogue to the Holocaust Museum, the synagogue that they had attended as children. She had forgotten that her mother had presented that testimonial and that it occurred prior to the release of the movie. It was not easy for my aunt to delve into her traumatic memories, but she felt that she needed to find the courage necessary to share her experiences and to honor the people who were not able to speak. She wanted to remind people of the power we all possess to make a choice, to do good and help others as Oskar Schindler did, or to ignore, to hate, and destroy. She explained why she must speak for those who could not, that she would not let the fact that she had survived simply be the end. In February 2016, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum honored my Aunt Helen with its National Leadership Award, which meant to her that her message was hitting home. To quote my Aunt Helen, "We were blessed to have been saved by a good man, Oskar Schindler, who saved the lives of Jews because he found his humanity and it was the right thing to do. As she always said to me, we must raise awareness and work toward a better world. It is urgent that the next generation give real meaning to never again. Only education about the truth of the Holocaust history can do that." Many of the survivors speaking out today were children during the Holocaust, and as their voices, like the voices of older generations, diminish, it is up to all of us to carry on their testimony about the destructive power of hate. On December 20th, 2018, unfortunately, my aunt passed away at the age of 93, and now more than ever, it is my responsibility, along with her children and grandchildren, to continue her legacy. This is a commitment we must all embrace. Thank you.
Thank you all.
I'm open for questions. If anybody has any questions, please feel free.
How many people here have seen Schindler's List?
Wow.
Oh, good, good. What are your children thinking about listening to music? Well, here's your chance to to touch base with someone connected.
So your aunt did think the movie was a good depiction of what happened?
She said it was 99% accurate. And I don't know if any of you have seen the film more recently, but there's a part in the movie, you know, when they divert the train with the women to Auschwitz. She said that part was a little tricky. It was a little unclear why they were diverted there. I haven't seen the movie in a long time, but it had something to do with Schindler being thrown into prison, and somebody got some wrong instructions because the women and the men were in two separate trains. So she said that was the only thing that seemed a little tricky in the film. She said otherwise everything was depicted perfectly.
I have a question, and this may just be my ignorance. It sounded like you were saying that in Auschwitz, they would be put in the room, and it would either be water or gas. Was that a regular occurrence?
Yeah.
So they were put down there in those rooms often, and they never knew.
But what's interesting is at the very beginning of the war, they all thought they were just going to get showers. They didn't know what was going on. By the time my mother and her sisters were in Auschwitz, it was much closer to the end, and they already knew what could potentially happen in that room.
Your father, you said to me he was a survivor. Where was he?
So I don't, again, I learned about the story of my mother and her sisters. I was 31 years old, 32. My father was from a smaller town in Poland, and he was never in a camp, and he was always running. What happened was, he had a younger brother. His younger brother ended up going to Israel. Their father was a Hebrew teacher, but he did it secretly in their town because there were very few Jews in their town, and something could happen if they found out. And he always told his two boys they should go to Palestine and learn Torah and whatever. And my paternal grandfather passed away before the war. And so my uncle, my father's younger brother, chose to go to Israel, asked my father to go with him, and he said, someone has to stay with our mother. So my father stayed with his mother, and what was happening as the war was breaking out, parents were sending their children away, hoping that the children could survive. So my grandmother sent my father away, and he was always on the run. I think there were 2 years in his life that he got hidden by a doctor who wasn't Jewish, who was a friend of his, who had a small hospital, and my father was hidden in that hospital. And he was liberated towards the end of 1944, and he joined the Polish Army. I don't know a lot of his story, except that I do know in order for him to survive, he managed to get supplies from the black market and then resell them so that he could survive. But that's really all I know. It was already too late in life to try to get his story. My sister and I tried to record it, but he was already older and he couldn't really give it to us in a progressive manner, so we never really got it recorded. But thank you for asking.
I don't get how the list really helped people in the camps.
Well, number one, that was the only list. I don't know of any other list that existed, and basically what he did, Oskar Schindler told the Germans, these people are working for me. So he was protecting them, and then he got them away from the camp, and he saved them. And he was able to get them to his factory in Brunlitz, Czechoslovakia, towards the end of the war, and he saved them from getting killed. He just formulated this list. When you're old enough, and you feel the desire, the movie's 3.5 hours, you can watch the movie and then you'll understand the progression, how he builds this list. It's quite amazing. I mean, he has this Jewish man he hires as his treasurer, stenographer, whatever, and he's sitting there and creating the list, and they're taking names from all different people. It's quite amazing. answer your question. Please,
I have another one.
as many as you'd like.
I saw your aunt met Get's, is it Get?
Daughter.
Get's daughter. What
Okay.
was that like? Did she?
Everybody always asks that question. So now it brings up another story. So Steven Spielberg and this man, James Moll. James Moll helped Steven Spielberg put together the Shoah Foundation on the premises of Universal Studios. And while they were working on it, they started premiering Schindler's List in different countries. So they get to Germany, I think it was in Frankfurt, and Eamon Get's daughter is at the premiere. And she walks up to them and she says, I was always told by my mother, who she hated, that my father was a hero. And I just learned from seeing this movie that he was a killer, he was a murderer. My father wasn't a hero, and she just breaks up. And she says to them, to Spielberg, somehow she managed to work her way up to meet them. I don't know all the specifics. She said to them, I want to meet the women who worked for my father in the villa. So, they kind of looked at each other, they had to figure out, we'll figure this out. And so Steven Spielberg reached out to my aunt. The other woman who was with her in the villa, her name was Lena. She says at the beginning of her speech, she talks about how she's telling Lena she has to go try and save her sisters off the line. So her name was Lena, and Emmett Get called my aunt Susanna because both of their names were Helen. He gave my aunt another name while she was working for him. And Steven Spielberg called my aunt and said, I think Emmett Get's daughter would like to meet you. And we are thinking if you would be interested and you would go along with this, we are thinking that we would like to do a documentary of you meeting her at the original site of the camp in Krakow, Poland. And this was probably like in 2003. So, think the war ended in 1945. That was almost 60 years later. And my aunt said, I'm not going back to my country. The Polish people hated the Jews. They didn't do anything for us. And she's going on. And then she gets this letter from the daughter. My aunt was telling me the story later, and she was thinking about it. How much she wants to meet her, and, she understands that Steven Spielberg and this gentleman would like to do this documentary. James Moll does documentaries. He produces documentaries. So I think she thought about it for a few months, and then she finally agreed. So in 2004, my aunt went to Krakow, almost 60 years later. And there is a documentary called Inheritance. It's 70 minutes long, and it tells the story of the two women meeting. And it, it starts from the beginning. It takes you from my aunt and my cousin are in the film with her, and it takes you from them making their trip to Krakow, and 70 minutes of what transpired. So, I think PBS got the rights for the film, and somebody called Oprah Winfrey, and she decided she agreed to interview my aunt and the daughter, and then it premiered in several museums throughout the country, like in October of 2008, and then in November was the Oprah show, and I think towards the end of November, beginning of December, it was on PBS. So, yeah, pretty amazing. And James Moll produced it. And Steven Spielberg was not credited for it. He didn't want his name attached.
And it's accessible, you can still get it, I think.
BJC has it if you want to borrow it, right? Remember? Jeanette was responsible for purchasing it, right? And we showed it. And I had the opportunity to show it. So it premiered, one of the museums it premiered at was at the Holocaust time was a development director for a Jewish organization called Hillel on Goucher and Tassin, and their Hillel organization. So I called this contact person and I said, I had students who are studying Holocaust education at both Towson University and Goucher College, and what's the possibility of me bringing about 30 or 40 students? I don't care, but I'm going to be there, there's no question. You know, and then he told me the price of the tickets. I said, we can't afford that. I said, but I know a couple of Baltimore donors who sit on your board, and maybe somebody would be willing to sponsor this. And lo and behold, somebody did, and we took 40 students, and the Holocaust Museum, I don't know why they were closed that day. They were closed that day. They gave them a private tour. It was wonderful. My aunt and the producer came, not the daughter, we didn't invite her. My aunt and the producer came, and it was amazing because the museum had 4 people on a panel, along with the producer and my aunt. So they showed the film, and then they had a dialogue. It was fantastic. Were you there?
No.
It was fantastic. So, and then I brought it to Goucher College in February of 2009. And Towson, I actually showed it in both. But at Goucher has that huge auditorium. We probably had about 250, 300 people. It was lovely. So, to answer your question, please.
I have to make a comment about Poland today. It came about this Ukraine-Russian war. Poland is a hero to me. They're the first European country that opened their doors to the Ukrainian people and their families and took them in. And if you know any history about Poland, you know why they did it. They never forgot how they were treated World War II, from the Nazis to the west and the Russians to the east. They both squeezed Poland till Poland was no longer Poland, and they never forgot, and no one helped them. No one helped these people. And they stood up when this Ukraine-Russian war started and welcomed them.
And I wish my aunt was alive now to see that, but I'm going to tell you, I've been to Krakow twice. I went first on a trip with my husband, we did Eastern Europe, but the second time I went with students. And I had the opportunity to meet with students attending the University of Krakow. None of them were Jewish, all taking Jewish studies and interning at the Jewish Community Center in Krakow, where we spent a lot of time with the students. I can't tell you how amazing it was. Poland, you know, there were a lot of Polish people who helped Jews, but unfortunately in my aunt's mind, because nobody was protecting them and their community, that is her state of mind. And I had many conversations with her. Yes, I say it in my speech, you know, how she felt, but there were many Poles who helped Jews, many. So thank you for sharing that.
I do have a story also about my mother. She was born in Hungary, in Sutton, most northeast of Hungary. And of course, the Jewish people in Hungary, the Nazis left alone until 1944 because they were allied. So they had moved on their part. And we didn't know this, and I was too young to ask any questions. My mother came to this country in 1909. This has nothing to do with Poland, is it? Okay, to tell the story. She came here in 1909, steering. Her father put her on the ship, and she came here, and her sister was already here and met her. And they were sponsored by a Hungarian family. And she never went back. She never saw her brothers and sisters or her mother and father. wife Marisha and hidden in a potato cellar. Now, the point is, my grandmother was Jewish. So therefore, my mother has to be Jewish, right? And that's another story. But we were brought up Catholic. She married a Catholic. And we heard the story, and I start writing to my uncle, my aunt, and what happened to my mother's family? Where did any survive other than you? And they said no. There were 4 brothers and a sister there. And they were grown-ups, they must have had children, maybe have grandchildren, for all I know. So sorry. Nothing. I tried and tried, and I couldn't get any satisfaction, you know. So,
Well, thank you for sharing that
that's the
story.
story on my mother's side. But she converted to Catholicism.
In 2012, we had a Trinity Jew here, Helena Silver, a blessed memory. She died this past November, a friend of ours. And her husband had a quote about Oscar Schindler, which I think is incredible. You don't have to be a saint to do saintly things. Because as you hear, and if you watch the movie, you know he was no saint. But we've got to thank Lola for coming here.
Thank you, everyone.
We need to thank, first of all, the parish itself for supporting this program all these years, for Father Muncie Witzenbach, our pastor, Father Scott Cady, our associate pastor, Kate Kleintank, I would love to thank her. She's not here, but she helped organize the first program, and my sister back there, my husband over there. Most of all, when we think about this, we thank Stephen, who's the director of music here, but he's a jack of all trades. He does everything wonderfully. So we all love Stephen. Thank you, Stephen. Now, if you go back to the conference center, we have pastries and cookies from Parisa, they're kosher. And drinks.
So I think who really needs the thank you is you, Jeanette. Years here at Resurrection, and she starts back months ago, just making sure it's on the calendar. And we do thank you for always finding a speaker, for always wanting young people to be involved in it, and we're very grateful for all that you've done here at Resurrection to remind us so that we will never forget. So thank you so much.
Thank you.